I think that this episode of Lovecraft Country, Holy Ghost, is going to be a turning point for the show. And I don't know if it's going to be a good turning point or a bad turning point. But I can't really discuss why I think that without getting into spoilers. So if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. If you give me a like, I'd really appreciate that. And now I'm going to get into spoilers, so you've been warned. This episode was probably a big departure from what people were expecting from Lovecraft Country, because we've gotten used to these shows that kind of stretch one plot or, essentially one overall story over an 8 to 10 episode season, the way Stranger Things has. And this has turned into something a lot more episodic. And I think this is going to be the episode where people are like, what? I thought that this was going to continue to focus on the characters roaming around Lovecraft Country getting chased by racist sheriffs. So for them to so quickly return to Chicago and to move in a different direction with this plot line with Jurnee, Smollett's Letitia moving into this house in a predominantly white neighborhood and dealing with a potential supernatural presence in the house, that's got to be a little bit surprising to people. It changed into a completely different type of story as well. Instead of being what it was in the first two episodes, in this episode it feels more akin to The Conjuring or Insidious or one of those types of haunted house movies, that type of horror. Now it still has that unique twist of having these African American protagonists and showing them dealing with a lot of the racial issues that would have been going on in 1955. But it's definitely, I think, jarring to have this plot shift so much and have it turn into something more episodic. And if you weren't prepared for this, I'm not sure how you will respond. I think that it might be a turnoff to some people, but for me personally, it's not, just because I get tired of watching plot lines get stretched so long, as is often the case with shows on Netflix, where you have a season of something that would be good if it was, like 5 to 6 episodes, but then it gets stretched to 13 episodes and you're like, man, there's just a lot of filler and there's a lot of sag in the middle of these seasons. And I think that this is potentially a good way to avoid that. Now, I will say I felt like the last 2 episodes of Lovecraft Country have felt very, very rushed. I feel like they potentially could have made the second episode be 2 episodes just to give it a little bit more room to breathe, or made it like 20 minutes longer. And I felt kind of that this episode could have been 2 episodes or had another 20 minutes just to give it a little bit of room to breathe, because they had to deal with, the racism of the people in the neighborhood they were moving into, and with all the supernatural elements going on in the house. And I feel like there's a lot to explore there. Now, it's not completely closed off. Like, they could still explore some stuff in the Winthrop house more, but for the most part, I felt like they left things relatively close-ended, as they did in the book. So I was prepared for this because I read the book, but I know a lot of people weren't. But I feel that this could have been longer, sketched out more. I felt like there were a lot of aspects of this that just were too quickly dealt with. For example, they had the scene where Letitia comes out of the house, and the show continues to have a wonderful, wonderful soundtrack, but she comes out of the house when the neighbors are being bad at the party, and the music is playing, and it was this bouncy tune. And this was an example of, I feel like, the characters acting like they don't know the world they live in. I mentioned in the first episode that Atticus seemed very, very aware of how people were going to respond to them, and he didn't act like an idiot, not expecting to get treated badly by racists. But here, Letitia's response just seemed kind of like she wasn't thinking this through, like she wasn't thinking through the fact that the cops probably would show up and probably would have treated them a lot more harshly than they do in this episode in real life. I'm kind of surprised at how quickly she was released and allowed to go back to her home. I feel that in real life she might not have gotten out of this situation alive. So again, I feel like the rushed nature of this episode contributed to that. They could have had an explanation for how she got out of police custody, how she got out of the dangerous situation she was in the back of that police vehicle, as the police officer was kind of vaguely threatening her. And I felt like it really didn't deal with the fact that it would be the whole neighborhood against them. This was something that was definitely present in the book, but I didn't feel like it was as much developed here. It kind of almost felt like there was just a few bad kids in the neighborhood that were harassing them, not the whole neighborhood being against them as it actually would have been. And I felt like they could have developed that more. I also felt that the supernatural elements in the house didn't get as much development as they could. There were some interesting scenes. Again, I love the soundtrack. I love the music that they played as Letitia confronted the ghost that was inhabiting Atticus's body. I thought that scene was well directed. I liked some of the very, very gory touches with the elevator. Clearly, it was kind of a Chekhov's elevator situation where they set up at the beginning of the episode that the elevator almost hit Letitia, and then at the end of the episode it graphically decapitates this person who has snuck into the house up to no good. And at the end of the episode, when they show the 3 bodies in the basement, I guess you could take that to be a hint that there's going to be more there, but I kind of felt like it was closed off more or less. Based on what happens in the book, I don't really expect them to develop the fallout from these missing characters. And they didn't actually die in the book. In the book, they just got a fright and left, or were allowed to leave eventually. But here, they're obviously dead, and a lot darker, a lot harsher stakes. But for an episode that was delving into so many horrors, both, the horrors of being a black person in 1955 trying to move into a white neighborhood, and the horrors of the supernatural aspect in this house, I really didn't feel a whole lot of tension or scared myself this episode. I enjoyed the episode. I was very, very entertained. I particularly liked the development of Letitia and Atticus's relationship, but I was never really frightened. So this is not really doing it from the horror perspective for me personally. But as I said, I did like the relationship between Tick and Letty. I do feel like this feels a little bit rushed, and it never really got entirely developed for me why these two would want to be together. It kind of just feels like he's the protagonist, she's the protagonist. Naturally, they're going to fall in love and have a relationship. But I felt like they could have done a little bit more to explain what Letty sees in Tick. I understood from the previous episodes that she had interest in him romantically, particularly from her fantasy sequence. But here in this episode, it was a little bit unclear to me why she's interested in him. Obviously, she teases him by dancing with another man at the party. And it's interesting how incongruous I feel like the different aspects of Letty's character are. Like, nothing about her character so far would have indicated to me anyway that she was a virgin, but she is. And she has this entrepreneurial spirit that she wants to be able to give people a place to live in this nice neighborhood and to create low-income housing for people from her community. And, that's a lot of really positive aspects. But there's also she kind of seemed like a fly by the seat of your pants, inconsiderate person in the first 2 episodes, particularly in her relationship with her brother and with Ruby. And we see a little bit more of that this episode with the way that she handles her mother's inheritance with Ruby. She kind of tries to do a backdoor nice thing by not letting her sister know that she had been left all the inheritance and that Ruby didn't get any of it. But when it eventually came out, I felt very, very bad for Ruby. And I also just kind of felt like it didn't cast Letty in the best light, that she has been kind of this immature person and she continues to just kind of plow full speed ahead towards what she wants without necessarily considering the feelings of other people around her. And I definitely sympathize with Ruby a lot in that. Again, I enjoyed this episode. Would have liked to see a little bit more time for things to gestate, to get developed. I enjoyed the party. I thought that that was a nice scene, although I was confused as to why these characters would feel so comfortable throwing this party in a neighborhood that clearly doesn't want them there. I would think they'd want to be very careful not to give the police any excuse to kick them out. I just felt like there should have been a lot more exploration of that in particular, of what it would be like in the neighborhood. And I felt like in the book there was. So that's partially where I'm coming from. I realize a lot of people kind of already can guess at what this would be like. Some of you probably have a better understanding of this than others. I'm sure a lot of you have a better understanding of what this would be like than I would. But I definitely felt that it would have been nice just to see it developed a little bit more. There was definitely some interesting moments with the supernatural elements. I thought the Ouija board scene in particular was interesting. The special effects were not quite fully rendered, particularly for the baby on top of the zombified body. I felt like that was not really ready for prime time, needed a little bit more work. I thought that the tease for next week's episode was decent. I liked how they explained what was going on during the ceremony and how Christina Braithwaite had kind of staged a coup with her father that indirectly saved Atticus's life. I find this character interesting. I know a lot of people might find her a little bit over the top and campy, but I just find her intriguing. I think that she adds a needed component to this show. I think that it's going to be interesting to see if the show runs out of steam as it continues down the stretch. This episode was a good episode. It was a solid episode. But compared to that first episode, which felt really cinematic and felt really, really well developed, I think that these last two episodes have felt a little less special, a little bit more rushed. And I hope that by the end of this season, they can get back to the high quality of the first episode. I think that HBO tends to do really, really good season finales. If you've ever watched Westworld, they have really, really good season finales. And I feel that typically that's where HBO shows tend to shine. Game of Thrones always used to do this. So hopefully Lovecraft Country can kind of turn it around and bring it back to that high level of quality. This was a good episode of television. For most shows, this would be, one of the greatest episodes of the season. But for this particular show, I feel like it's a little bit of a dip in quality. Directed by Daniel Sackheim, who actually has directed episodes of Game of Thrones, among other shows. Very prolific TV director. Not a very special director, not a household name by a long shot, but pretty competent. So overall, liked this episode. Could have been better, but I just wish it had been a little bit more fully fleshed out. Now, I do not know why this show is not rated higher than it is on IMDb. I mean, I have a theory, and it isn't very flattering to the people who are rating it poorly, but I'm not going to say what that is just because I feel like it's not fair to assume that people have bad motivations, but I tend to think people have bad motivations in this situation. But at any rate, I'm still enjoying this show, still plan to keep reviewing it on a week-to-week basis. If you're interested in seeing more reviews on this channel, including my upcoming reviews of Raised by Wolves, The Boys, Season 2, and Away, something for everyone, hopefully. I'm planning on putting those out this week, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd stick around and watch those videos. So if you'd consider subscribing, I'd appreciate that. If you give me a like, appreciate that as well. And if you want, you can watch more videos right now.